Chapter 1. You're wearing something. But why? Tomorrow morning your alarm will go off, you'll drag yourself out of bed, and at some point in the next 20 minutes you'll do something that 300,000 years of human evolution have made feel completely automatic. You'll get dressed. You won't think about it much. You'll grab something, put it on, maybe glance in the mirror, maybe not. And then you'll walk out the door and spend the rest of the day thinking about literally anything else. And that automatic quality, that total absence of conscious deliberation around one of the most human things you do, is exactly the thing that should make you stop and ask a question you've probably never actually asked. Not why did you choose that specific shirt, but why do you get dressed at all? Why does every human being on Earth, in every culture that has ever existed, in every climate from the equator to the Arctic, cover their body? Why is there not a single documented human society anywhere in the historical or anthropological record that simply doesn't bother? Not one. Not anywhere. The answer most people reach for is warmth. It's the obvious answer, the intuitive answer, the answer that feels so self-evidently correct it seems almost embarrassing to question it. People were cold. They needed insulation. They used animal hides. Problem solved, mystery explained, next question. Except it doesn't explain anything. Because the moment you look at the actual timeline of when clothing appeared in the archaeological record and where humans were living at that time, the warmth theory doesn't just weaken, it collapses completely. And what you find underneath it is something far stranger, far more interesting, and far more revealing about the specific kind of creature that we are. Let's start with the numbers. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens, humans with the same brain, the same body, the same cognitive architecture as you, first appeared on Earth roughly 300,000 years ago. This is not a rough estimate or an educated guess. It's established by the fossil record, confirmed most definitively by discoveries at the site of Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, described in a landmark 2017 paper in the journal Nature by a team led by Jean-Jacques Hublin of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. 300,000 years. Now look at when the oldest unambiguous evidence of clothing production appears. Bone needles and specialized hide-scraping tools don't show up in the archaeological record until roughly 40,000 years ago in Europe, and even the most generous estimates for their appearance elsewhere push back only to around 120,000 years ago. In 2021, evolutionary archaeologist Emily Hallett of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History published findings in the journal iScience from excavations at Contrebandiers Cave on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Her team found 62 tools made from animal bones alongside a very specific pattern of cut marks on the bones of foxes, jackals, and wildcats, cut marks that indicated these animals had been skinned for fur, not butchered for meat. The tools were used to scrape and process hides. The artifacts date to between 120,000 and 90,000 years ago, making them the oldest direct physical evidence of clothing production ever found. But notice what that still means. For the first 180,000 years of our existence as a species, more than half our entire history, there is no evidence of clothing production. None. We were anatomically modern, cognitively sophisticated, socially complex humans living without clothes. In Africa, in the tropics, where the average temperature was nowhere near lethal, where the cold theory doesn't even begin to apply. And here's where it gets even harder to square with the warmth explanation. We know from genetic research into human skin pigmentation that our ancestors lost their body hair, the thick coat of fur that covered our primate ancestors, approximately 1 million years ago. 1 million. That means for 900,000 years before clothing appeared, humans and their immediate predecessors were naked, hairless primates living in sub-Saharan Africa, and they survived just fine. The cold was not killing them. The absence of fur was not an unsolved existential crisis. They managed. So the question becomes, if we survived naked in Africa for nearly 1 million years, what changed? What happened between then and 170,000 years ago? Because that is the date that the most precise evidence points to, that made clothing not just useful but apparently necessary. The answer to that question came not from an archaeological dig, and not from a fossil site, but from a genetics laboratory, and the organism that provided it was not a human. It was a louse. David Reed is the Associate Curator of Mammals at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida, and he studies lice. Not as a hobby with questionable social consequences, but as a window into human evolutionary history, because lice, it turns out, are extraordinarily faithful record keepers of the biology of the bodies they live on. Reed spent 5 years on a study funded by the National Science Foundation, the results of which were published in the January 2011 issue of Molecular Biology and Evolution, and the study was built on a piece of biological logic that is almost elegant in its simplicity. There are 2 kinds of lice that live on humans. Head lice live in hair. Body lice, also called clothing lice, live in fabric. Body lice cannot survive without clothing. They lay their eggs exclusively in the seams and folds of garments. Remove the clothing, and within a generation or 2, the body louse population collapses because they have nowhere to reproduce. This means body lice as a species could not have evolved before clothing existed. They are entirely dependent on it. So Reed's team sequenced the DNA of both species and calculated the point at which they genetically diverged, the moment in evolutionary history when body lice split from head lice and began adapting specifically to life in fabric rather than hair. That moment of divergence is, by definition, the moment humans started wearing clothes consistently enough for an entire species to evolve around the habit. The date the DNA pointed to, approximately 170,000 years ago. That is the oldest timestamp for human clothing we have. And it doesn't come from a bone or a tool. It comes from a parasite that has been living in our clothes ever since we invented them. But here's the part that truly destroys the cold theory, the part that Reed himself emphasized when discussing the findings. The data shows that humans started wearing clothes approximately 70,000 years before they began migrating out of Africa into colder climates. 70,000 years before they needed it for warmth. 70,000 years before the cold was even a factor. Clothing didn't appear because humans moved into cold environments. Clothing appeared, and then, 70,000 years later, it helped humans move into cold environments. The cause and effect that everyone assumes are reversed, which means the actual reason clothing appeared has nothing to do with temperature. It has nothing to do with any practical external need. It has everything to do with something that was happening inside the human brain during that specific period. Something that changed the way humans perceived themselves, perceived each other, and perceived their own bodies. And that change is the real story. Not the hide, not the needle, not the cold. What changed inside the mind of a human being 170,000 years ago that made them look at an animal skin and see, for the first time in the history of life on this planet, not food, not waste, not raw material, but something to wear. That is the question. And the answer reaches into the deepest structures of human cognition, into the neuroscience of self-awareness, into the evolutionary origins of shame, into the social architecture that made our species the most dominant and most complex social organism that has ever existed on Earth. And it starts, in the next chapter, with 150,000 years of nakedness, and what was going on in the human brain the whole time. Chapter 2. Naked for 150,000 years. There's a question almost nobody asks, and that's exactly why it's the most important one. What was happening to humans during all those years they were naked? What exactly changed at some point that made one of our ancestors reach for an animal hide, not for warmth, but for some completely different reason? And to answer it, you first need to understand what state the human brain was in during that long period before, because that's where the real answer is hidden, and it will turn out to be significantly stranger than you might expect, because it has nothing to do with climate, predators, or practical necessity, but with the emergence of a fundamentally new type of thinking that had never existed in any living creature on Earth before that moment. And here's what it looked like from the inside. Imagine waking up in the morning with no ability to think about tomorrow, none whatsoever. You exist only in the present moment. You see food and take it. You feel cold and find shelter. You detect a threat and run. That's exactly how the brain of the vast majority of animals works, including our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. And that's exactly how the brain of early Homo sapiens worked for hundreds of thousands of years. It was brilliantly adapted to the present, but essentially blind to the future. And this distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire story, because what separates a creature that wears clothes from a creature that doesn't is not anatomy, and not intelligence in the general sense. It is specifically the capacity for what cognitive scientists call mental time travel, the ability to project yourself forward into an imagined future and work backward from that imagined future to shape your behavior in the present. And this capacity is rarer in the animal kingdom than almost any other cognitive trait we know of. Ian Gilligan, Honorary Associate in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Sydney, and author of the monograph Climate, Clothing, and Agriculture in Prehistory, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, one of the most comprehensive academic treatments of the subject ever written, has dedicated most of his career to understanding the cognitive prerequisites for clothing, and his conclusion is stated with unusual directness for an academic. To put on clothing means to imagine a future version of yourself. It requires memory, planning, and the capacity to think about something that doesn't yet exist. And that is precisely what separates humans from all other animals, not biologically, but cognitively. And when you sit with that for a moment, the implications are enormous, because it means clothing is not just a product of human intelligence. It is a diagnostic of a very specific kind of human intelligence, the kind that can hold a mental model of itself in the future and act in the present to shape that future model, the kind that can look at a dead animal and not just see what it is but what it could become. And this kind of thinking didn't appear all at once. It emerged gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, leaving traces in the archaeological record that scientists have spent decades learning to read. And for a long time, they read those traces wrong, because the dominant theory for most of the 20th century was that the great cognitive leap, the moment when human thinking became truly modern, happened around 40,000 years ago in Europe. This was called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or the Human Revolution. It was associated with the sudden appearance of cave paintings, like those at Lascaux and Altamira, ornaments made from bone and shell, sophisticated tools made through complex multi-step processes, musical instruments, including the oldest known flutes carved from vulture and mammoth bone found in the Swabian Jura region of Germany. And it looked like a genuine discontinuity in the record, like something had switched on in the human brain at that specific moment. Stanford paleoanthropologist Richard Klein was the most prominent advocate of this view, arguing in his influential book The Human Career, first published in 1989, that a neurological change, possibly a genetic mutation affecting the organization of language circuits in the brain, had triggered the sudden flowering of symbolic behavior around 40,000 years ago. And for a while this explanation held, but then archaeologists started digging in Africa, and everything that seemed settled came apart, because in Blombos Cave on the southern tip of South Africa, a site that had been known since the 1990s, but whose full significance took years to establish, Christopher Henshilwood of the University of the Witwatersrand and his colleagues began pulling out objects that simply shouldn't have existed according to the European timeline. 49 deliberately perforated Nacerius kraussianus shells, tiny marine snail shells with holes punched through them and traces of red ochre on their surfaces, clearly strung as beads and worn as personal ornaments, dated to 75,000 years ago, 35,000 years before the so-called Human Revolution was supposed to have happened, and alongside them 13 pieces of red ochre incised with deliberate geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines, parallel lines, organized markings that served no functional purpose and can only be interpreted as symbolic expression. These findings were published in the Journal of Human Evolution in 2009, and they forced a fundamental revision of the timeline. But Blombos was not alone. Similar evidence began accumulating from sites across southern Africa, pigment workshops at Pinnacle Point dating to 164,000 years ago, where humans were mixing ochre with other materials to create compound substances, shell beads from Bismoon Cave in Morocco dated to over 142,000 years ago, as reported by a research team in Science Advances in 2021, engraved geometric patterns on ostrich eggshells from the Deep Kloof rock shelter dated to 60,000 years ago. And the picture that emerged from all of this was not of a sudden revolution, 40,000 years ago, but of a long, gradual, fitful development of symbolic and abstract thinking stretching back well over 100,000 years in Africa. A development that was happening precisely during the same period when, according to the Louse DNA evidence, humans were beginning to wear clothes. And this convergence is not coincidental. It is the key to understanding why clothing appeared when it did, because symbolic thinking and the capacity for clothing are not two separate developments. They are expressions of the same underlying cognitive shift, the emergence of a mind that can assign meaning to objects beyond their physical properties, that can see a shell not just as a shell, but as a marker of identity, that can see a hide not just as a hide, but as a potential covering that will change how others perceive the person wearing it. And this last element, the awareness that others perceive you and that you can influence what they perceive, is the hinge on which the entire history of clothing turns. Because once a human brain becomes capable of modeling how it appears in the minds of other humans, the body is no longer just a body. It becomes a surface, a signal, a text that others are reading, and the desire to edit that text, to control what it says, to manage the impression it creates. That desire is not vanity and not superficiality. It is the direct and inevitable consequence of developing a sophisticated social brain. And 150,000 years of nakedness was not 150,000 years of not caring how you looked. It was 150,000 years of a brain that was not yet capable of asking that question. And the moment it became capable, clothing followed as surely as night follows day. And in the next chapter, we'll look at exactly what that cognitive shift felt like from the inside, and why the emotion it produced is one of the most distinctly human experiences that exists. Chapter 3. Shame and the Theory of Mind. There is one experiment that changed everything science thought it knew about the line between humans and animals, and it was conducted not in a grand laboratory with expensive equipment, but in a fairly ordinary room at the University at Albany in 1970 by a psychologist named Gordon Gallup, Jr., and the setup was almost comically simple. He put chimpanzees in front of mirrors, let them get used to their reflections over several days, then anesthetized them and painted small red marks on their foreheads, areas of their faces they couldn't see without a mirror, and watched what happened when they woke up. And what happened was this. The chimpanzees reached up and touched the marks on their own faces, not the reflection, not the image in the glass, but their actual physical foreheads, which means they understood that the thing in the mirror was them, that the reflection was a representation of their own body, that they were looking at themselves. And this was published in Science that same year under the deceptively simple title, Chimpanzees, Self-Recognition. And it became one of the most cited papers in the history of comparative psychology, because what Gallup had demonstrated was that chimpanzees possess something that almost no other animal on Earth possesses, a sense of self, an awareness of themselves as distinct objects that exist in the world and can be perceived by others. And in the decades since, researchers have found this capacity in a small and select group of species: great apes, bottlenose dolphins, Asian elephants, Eurasian magpies, and possibly a few others, a tiny fraction of the millions of species that have ever existed. And this rarity tells you something important about how cognitively expensive self-awareness is, how much neural machinery it requires, how significant a development it represents in the history of animal minds. But here is the thing that matters most for the story of clothing. Chimpanzees recognize themselves in mirrors, and that is essentially where their self-awareness ends. Because what humans do with self-awareness goes so far beyond what chimpanzees do that it barely seems like the same cognitive phenomenon. Because a chimpanzee that recognizes itself in a mirror does not then spend the rest of the day wondering what the other chimpanzees thought of how it looked. It does not lie awake at night replaying a social interaction and cringing at something it did. It does not feel a retrospective flush of embarrassment about its appearance at an event 3 years ago. It does not stand in front of a selection of objects and agonize over which one to put on its body because of how that choice will be interpreted by the specific individuals it is about to encounter. Only humans do all of those things, and the cognitive machinery that makes all of those things possible is what psychologists call theory of mind, the capacity to model the mental states of other individuals, to understand that other people have their own beliefs, desires, intentions, and perceptions that are separate from and potentially different from your own, to step outside your own perspective and simulate the perspective of another person looking at you. And theory of mind is the cognitive foundation on which shame is built, because shame, real shame, not just the pain of physical discomfort or the frustration of failure, requires you to see yourself through someone else's eyes, to model how you appear in their perception, to care about that perception, and to feel distress when the image you project does not match the image you want to project. And research published in 2025 in PMC by a consortium of neuroscientists from multiple European institutions describes shame as a pivotal component of socio-moral cognition that emerges specifically at the intersection of self-awareness, social evaluation, and internalized norms, meaning shame is not a simple emotion like fear or hunger. It is a complex social cognition that requires multiple sophisticated mental systems to be operating simultaneously and in coordination, and the neuroanatomy of shame is specific and mappable. The medial prefrontal cortex handles self-referential processing and the modeling of social perceptions. The anterior cingulate cortex monitors conflicts between actual and desired social states. The insula processes the visceral discomfort of social threat, and the amygdala assigns emotional weight to socially relevant stimuli. And all of these structures are significantly more developed in humans than in any other primate, which reflects the enormous selective pressure that complex social living placed on the evolution of social cognition in our lineage. But here is what makes all of this directly relevant to the history of clothing. Shame about the body specifically. The experience of feeling exposed or vulnerable or judged because of how your physical self appears to others is not possible without theory of mind. You cannot feel ashamed of your naked body unless you can model the experience of someone else looking at your naked body and forming a judgment about it, which requires you to simultaneously hold in your mind your own perspective and a simulated version of another person's perspective, and to care about the discrepancy between how you are and how you want to be perceived. And as Gallup himself argued in a 1977 paper in American Psychologist, self-awareness in primates evolved specifically as a social adaptation. The ability to model yourself as others see you is valuable precisely because it allows you to predict and influence social outcomes more effectively, to manage your status, to coordinate your behavior with social expectations, to navigate the extraordinarily complex landscape of primate social hierarchy. And clothing is the physical manifestation of that management impulse. It is what happens when a brain capable of modeling its own social appearance gains access to materials that can be used to modify that appearance. And the moment those two things, the cognitive capacity for self-modeling and the physical materials for body modification, came together in the same creature, clothing became not just possible, but inevitable. Because the brain that can ask, "How do I look?" is a brain that will always, given the opportunity, try to answer that question in its own favor. And this is why in every culture on Earth, without exception, people cover and decorate their bodies, because the impulse is not environmental and not practical. It is cognitive and social, and as universal as the brain architecture that produces it. And in the next chapter, we'll look at what happens when this deeply personal cognitive impulse meets the physical challenge of actual survival. When the needle and the hide become not symbols of identity, but tools of literal life and death. Chapter 4. The Needle, the Hide, and the Ice Age. Around 40,000 years ago, something changed in the archaeological record with a speed and definitiveness that had never been seen before. And what changed was not the human brain, that had been essentially modern for at least 130,000 years before that, but the physical technology of clothing, because suddenly, in sites across Europe and Asia and Africa, researchers start finding objects of extraordinary sophistication. Eyed needles carved from bone and ivory, some so fine and precisely made that they rival the quality of needles produced industrially in the 19th century, awls for punching holes in hides, scrapers for removing fat and tissue from skins, and from the patterns of wear on these tools and the residues left on them, we can reconstruct with remarkable precision what people were doing with them. They were making tailored garments, not just wrapping hides around their bodies but cutting them to shape, sewing pieces together, constructing fitted clothing that covered the body closely and trapped warm air against the skin. And the timing of this technological leap is not random. It coincides almost exactly with the period when modern humans began pushing into the coldest, most inhospitable environments on Earth. The mammoth steppes of Siberia, the periglacial tundra of northern Europe, the high-altitude plateaus of Central Asia, environments where without effective cold-weather clothing, survival would have been simply impossible. And here is where the warmth explanation finally does apply, not as the origin of clothing, but as the driver of its most significant technological revolution, because there is an enormous difference between draping an unprocessed hide over your shoulders and constructing a fitted, sewn, layered garment that covers your extremities and seals out wind and moisture. And that difference is the difference between surviving a mild African night and surviving a Siberian winter at -40 degrees. And the evidence for just how sophisticated this tailored clothing technology had become comes from multiple directions, from the tools themselves, from the residues on those tools, and most vividly from the bodies. Because in permafrost sites across Siberia and the Arctic, archaeologists have found human remains buried with extraordinary grave goods that include what can only be interpreted as evidence of elaborate tailored clothing. The Sungir burial site in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, contains the remains of a man and 2 children interred with thousands of mammoth ivory beads that had been sewn onto their garments in specific patterns that researchers have painstakingly reconstructed to show that these people were buried in fitted, decorated, multi-piece outfits of a sophistication that would not look out of place in a modern context. And what this tells us is that by this point, clothing had simultaneously become 2 things that seem almost contradictory: a matter of life or death physical survival in extreme environments, and a medium of extraordinary aesthetic and social expression. Because you do not sew thousands of ivory beads onto a burial garment because you are cold. You do it because clothing has become a language of identity and status and belonging that persists even beyond death. And this dual nature of clothing, simultaneously practical technology and social communication system, is one of the most consistent features of its entire history, and it appears to have been established very early, because the tailored clothing revolution of 40,000 years ago was not just a response to cold, it was a response to the increasing complexity of human social life, to the fact that as human groups grew larger and more interconnected, the social information that clothing could communicate became more valuable, more nuanced, and more elaborately encoded. And the needle, that deceptively simple tool, a sliver of bone with a hole through one end, was the instrument through which both of these imperatives were served simultaneously. It was the technology that made it possible to survive the Ice Age and to look like yourself while doing it. And in the next chapter, we'll look at the cognitive machinery that made all of this possible. The specific capacity that allowed humans not just to wear clothes, but to feel shame about their bodies, to care about how they appeared, to construct elaborate systems of social signaling through the things they chose to put on. Chapter 5. Clothing as Language. Picture this scene. Two strangers meet for the first time. Not today, not in the age of LinkedIn profiles and Instagram feeds where you can research someone for 20 minutes before you ever speak to them. But 10,000 years ago, at the edge of two different tribal territories, they see each other across an open field. Neither has ever encountered the other before. They share no common language, no mutual acquaintances, no shared cultural references, and in the first few seconds of that encounter, before a word is spoken, before a gesture is made, before either of them has done anything at all except exist in the other's visual field, each of them is already making rapid, high-stakes assessments of the other, and the primary data source for those assessments is not facial expression, not body language, not vocalizations, but clothing and bodily adornment. Because clothing in that context is not decoration and not fashion. It is information, densely packed, instantly readable information about who this person is, where they come from, what social position they occupy, whether they represent a threat or an opportunity, whether they are someone to approach or someone to flee from. The quality and construction of the hide tells you something about the skill and resources of the person wearing it. The specific pattern of ochre or pigment applied to the skin tells you something about tribal affiliation. The particular ornaments worn, shells from a specific coastline, bones from a specific animal, feathers from a specific bird, tell you something about the trade networks this person has access to, and therefore the social connections they can claim. The way the garment is constructed tells you something about the technological sophistication of the group this person belongs to, and all of this information is processed in fractions of a second, automatically, without conscious deliberation, by neural systems that evolved specifically to extract social information from visual signals, and this is what clothing actually is at its most fundamental level. It is a communication technology, a system for transmitting social information across the gap between two minds that have no other shared channel, and the argument that clothing is primarily practical, primarily about warmth or protection, runs headlong into the simple fact that the most clothing-obsessed societies in human history have almost invariably been those where the practical need for it was lowest, where the climate was temperate, where physical protection was not the driving concern, where the elaborate systems of clothing and adornment that developed served not survival needs but social ones. American sociologist and economist Thorstein Veblen understood this with unusual clarity when he published The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899, a book that remains one of the most incisive analyses of the social function of clothing ever written, despite being more than a century old, in which he introduced the concept of conspicuous consumption to describe the way clothing functions as a public display of economic status, a signal not of warmth or protection, but of wealth, leisure, and social position. And Veblen's insight was that the most socially effective clothing is often the most practically useless, the elaborate court dress of Versailles that made it impossible to move freely, the tightly corseted waist that made it difficult to breathe, the trailing skirts that made outdoor work impossible. All of these were signals of the same thing, that the wearer was so economically secure they could afford to be physically encumbered, that they did not need to work with their bodies, that they existed in a social stratum where the body was a medium of display rather than a tool of labor. And French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu deepened this analysis in his 1979 monograph Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste, by showing that clothing choices are not just signals of economic status, but expressions of what he called cultural capital, the accumulated knowledge, aesthetic sensibilities, and social competencies that mark membership in particular social classes, and what both Veblen and Bourdieu were describing from different angles and with different emphases was the same fundamental phenomenon: clothing as a language with a grammar, a vocabulary, and a set of rules that every member of a society learns to read fluently without ever being explicitly taught. Research in the field of social signal processing published in IEEE conference proceedings in 2017 directly confirms what Veblen and Bourdieu argued theoretically. Clothing carries measurable, quantifiable social signals that are read automatically and consistently across different observers, with correlations between clothing characteristics and attributed personality traits, social class, and professional status that are stable and reproducible across different cultural contexts. And the flexibility of this language, the fact that unlike the plumage of a bird or the coloration of a fish, human clothing can be changed, combined, modified, updated, and reinvented, is what makes it the most powerful social communication system that evolution has ever produced, because it means the same individual can signal completely different social identities in different contexts, can affiliate with different groups at different moments, can project different versions of themselves to different audiences. And this flexibility is not a modern development. It is as old as clothing itself. And in the next chapter, we'll see how it became the foundation of something even more powerful, a system of social hierarchy so effective and so deeply embedded in human culture that it took the force of law to maintain it. Chapter 6. The more complex the society, the more complex the clothes. There is a pattern that shows up across every civilization archaeologists have ever studied, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The moment human groups start growing larger, the moment hierarchies begin to form, the moment strangers start encountering other strangers on a regular basis, clothing doesn't just continue existing, it explodes in complexity, it multiplies, it differentiates, it becomes more elaborate, more codified, more rule-bound. And the reason for this is not aesthetic and not arbitrary, it is deeply functional, because clothing was solving a problem that became more urgent the larger and more complex human society grew, and that problem is this. In a small group of 30 people who have known each other since birth, you don't need clothing to communicate who you are. Everyone already knows. They know your status, your skills, your history, your place in the hierarchy. All of that information is stored in shared memory and updated constantly through daily interaction. But the moment groups begin to scale, and human groups did begin to scale dramatically, starting roughly 12,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture and permanent settlement, that system of shared memory breaks down, because you cannot personally know everyone in a town of 500 people. You cannot maintain intimate knowledge of everyone in a city of 5,000, and yet you need to be able to make rapid, accurate social assessments of people you have never met and may never meet again. You need to know in seconds whether the person approaching you is a priest or a soldier, a merchant or a slave, a friend or an enemy, someone who outranks you or someone who doesn't. And clothing becomes the answer to that problem. A system of instant legibility that works across the entire social body without requiring personal acquaintance. Anthropologist and sociologist Georg Simmel, in his 1904 essay Fashion, later republished in the American Journal of Sociology in 1957, identified this dual function with extraordinary precision. Clothing simultaneously expresses belonging and distinction. It says both, "I am one of you," and "I am not one of them." It allows individuals to affiliate with groups while differentiating themselves from other groups, and this dual signaling becomes exponentially more important as social complexity increases, because in a complex society, the cost of misreading someone's social position is high. You might offend someone who outranks you, or submit to someone who doesn't, or trust someone who belongs to a hostile faction, or exclude someone who could be a valuable ally, and clothing reduces that cost by making social position visually legible before a single word is exchanged. And the archaeological record documents this escalation with remarkable clarity. In the earliest agricultural settlements of the Near East, around 10,000 years ago, the material evidence for clothing is relatively undifferentiated. People are wearing roughly similar things, made from roughly similar materials, but by 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the picture has changed completely. Textiles have become specialized by function and status. Certain colors are restricted to certain ranks. Certain materials are forbidden to certain classes. Certain garments are worn only in certain ritual contexts. In ancient Rome, the toga praetexta, with its purple border, was legally reserved for magistrates and priests. A private citizen wearing it was committing a crime, not because the cloth itself was dangerous, but because the signal it sent was a lie, a false claim to a social position the wearer did not hold. And this tells us something profound. Clothing had become so central to the social information system that falsifying it was treated as a form of fraud, as a disruption to the legibility of the social order itself. And this pattern repeats across cultures with no contact with each other, in Han Dynasty China, in medieval Japan, in the Aztec Empire, in medieval Europe, in the Ottoman court. Every complex society independently developed what historians call sumptuary laws, legal codes governing who was allowed to wear what colors, what fabrics, what ornaments were permitted to which social ranks, and the fact that every complex society felt the need to legally enforce these clothing distinctions tells you exactly how important clothing had become as a social technology. Because you only need laws to protect a system that people are actively trying to game, you only need to legally prohibit a merchant from wearing silk if merchants are actually trying to wear silk. And they were, because clothing was not just describing social reality. It was constructing it. It was one of the primary mechanisms through which social hierarchy was made visible, reinforced, and reproduced. And here's what makes this truly remarkable. None of this was designed, none of it was planned by any central authority sitting down and deciding that clothing should serve these functions. It emerged organically from the same basic impulse that started everything, the impulse to control how you are seen, multiplied across millions of people interacting with millions of other people over thousands of years, and the result was one of the most sophisticated spontaneous information systems in human history, a system so effective that it still operates today in ways most people never consciously register. And in the next chapter, we'll look at the single most powerful element within that system, the one that empires were built around, that wars were fought over, and that people were executed for possessing without permission. Chapter 7. Color, Power, and the Purple That Built Empires. There is a color that was once worth more than gold, that was extracted from the bodies of sea snails at a rate of roughly 10,000 snails per gram of dye, that was worn exclusively by emperors and kings for centuries under penalty of death for anyone else who dared to use it, that gave its name to an entire Roman dynasty and an entire historical era, that was so deeply associated with supreme power that the phrase "born in the purple" became synonymous with being born into the highest possible social stratum, and that color is Tyrian purple, the dye produced from the murex sea snail, extracted from glands in the snail's body, processed through a complex and extraordinarily labor-intensive procedure that produced a color of stunning richness and remarkable permanence, a color that did not fade in sunlight, but actually intensified with exposure to light, and the history of this color is the history of how a single visual signal, a particular wavelength of light reflected from fabric, became one of the most powerful instruments of political authority in the ancient world. Because what purple did in the Roman Empire and in Byzantium and in the Persian court was what clothing has always done, but taken to its logical extreme. It made power visible. It made hierarchy legible. It made the distance between the ruler and the ruled immediately and unmistakably apparent to anyone within visual range, and the investment required to produce it. The fishing fleets, the processing facilities, the vast quantities of snails, the skilled workers, the time, was itself a signal, a demonstration that whoever wore this color commanded resources so vast that they could afford to wear their wealth literally on their backs. And Tyrian purple was not an isolated phenomenon, because the history of color in clothing is essentially the history of power expressed through textile, and it runs through every civilization that has ever existed. In ancient China, yellow was the exclusive property of the emperor, and wearing it without imperial permission was a capital offense. In medieval Europe, the production and sale of certain dyes was regulated by guilds with the same legal seriousness that we today regulate the production of weapons, indigo blue. A dye produced from the indigo plant, cultivated primarily in India and later in the Americas, became one of the most valuable traded commodities in the world, fueling the Atlantic slave trade in part because the labor required to produce it at scale was so intensive that it could only be made profitable through forced labor, and the color red, produced from madder root and later from cochineal insects harvested in Mexico after the Spanish conquest, became so central to European military uniforms that the sight of red-coated soldiers became one of the most recognizable symbols of European imperial power across the globe. And what all of these histories have in common is the same underlying dynamic. Color in clothing is not aesthetic preference. It is social information encoded in light. It is a signal that operates below the threshold of conscious analysis, that the brain reads automatically and instantly, that communicates status, affiliation, authority, and identity faster than any verbal message could, and the fact that every complex society in history has felt the need to regulate access to certain colors, to legally restrict who can wear what, is the most powerful possible evidence that this signal is real and consequential, that it actually changes how people are perceived and treated, that it is not a superficial aesthetic phenomenon, but a deep social one. And today, in a world where synthetic dyes have made every color available to everyone, where the sumptuary laws have long been repealed, and the purple of emperors is sold at fast fashion retailers for $15, the color hierarchies have not disappeared. They have simply become more complex and more subtle, because the brain that evolved to read color as social information does not stop doing that just because the legal restrictions have been removed. It continues to assign social meaning to color choices, to read navy blue as authority, and black as sophistication, and beige as approachability, and neon as youth, to interpret the color choices of others as data about their social identity. And this continues because the underlying cognitive machinery, the machinery that has been reading color as social signal since before humans had cities or laws or writing, is still running, still processing, still making the same ancient calculations it has always made. And in the next chapter, we'll look at what happens when that machinery meets deliberate political resistance, when clothing stops being a tool of the existing social order and becomes a weapon against it. Chapter 8. Fashion as Revolution. There is a moment in the history of the French Revolution that is not often described in the history books, but that captures something essential about the relationship between clothing and political power. And it happened in the streets of Paris in the early 1790s, when groups of radical revolutionaries began deliberately wearing the rough woolen trousers of the working class, the long trousers called pantalons, instead of the knee breeches called culottes, that had been the standard dress of the French aristocracy and bourgeoisie for generations, and these people called themselves the sans-culottes, literally the without-knee breeches people, and their choice of clothing was not a fashion statement in the modern sense, and not a practical adaptation to weather or work. It was a deliberate, politically calculated act of sartorial violence against the existing social order, a refusal to wear the visual markers of the class system that the revolution was trying to destroy. And it worked, because clothing works, because the brain reads clothing as social information automatically, and the signal that long trousers sent in 1790s, Paris was unmistakable. This person does not accept the legitimacy of the existing hierarchy. This person is claiming a political identity that rejects the visual language of the old order, and the aristocracy understood this perfectly, which is why they found it so threatening. Because a revolution that changes what people wear is a revolution that has reached the level of daily life, that has gotten inside the most intimate rituals of self-presentation and self-construction, and the French sans-culottes were not the first people to use clothing as a political weapon, and they were certainly not the last. Because the history of clothing is punctuated by moments when specific garments or specific ways of dressing became flashpoints for much larger conflicts about power, identity, and who gets to define the terms of social belonging. The corset is one of the clearest examples, a garment that was worn by women in Western societies for roughly 4 centuries, from the 16th century to the early 20th, that physically reshaped the body by compressing the waist and pushing the internal organs into different positions. That was medically controversial almost from its introduction, with physicians debating its health effects across multiple generations, and that became in the late 19th and early 20th centuries one of the central battlegrounds of the suffragist movement, because rejecting the corset was not just a health decision or a comfort preference. It was a statement about who controlled women's bodies, about whether women's physical existence should be shaped by the aesthetic preferences of men or by women's own choices. And the women who publicly abandoned the corset in the 1910s and 1920s were making the same kind of statement that the sans-culottes made in the 1790s, a deliberate refusal of a visual marker of a social order they rejected, and this pattern repeats across the 20th century with a consistency that makes the political function of clothing impossible to ignore. The blue jeans that were smuggled into the Soviet Union and worn by Soviet youth as a statement of identification with Western culture and rejection of Soviet conformity. Jeans as contraband, jeans as political dissent, jeans that the Soviet state felt threatened enough by to ban in certain contexts, the miniskirt of the 1960s that was experienced by an older generation as an assault on sexual morality and by a younger generation as a declaration of bodily autonomy and sexual liberation. The natural hair movement among Black Americans in the 1960s and 1970s that reclaimed African American hair texture as beautiful and powerful, rather than something to be chemically straightened to approximate white European aesthetics. The hijab that in different contexts has been simultaneously a symbol of religious devotion, a symbol of political resistance against Western cultural imperialism, a symbol of oppression depending entirely on who is doing the wearing and who is doing the looking. And what all of these examples share is the same underlying dynamic. Clothing as a site of contest over the fundamental question of who gets to define the terms of social identity, who gets to determine what a respectable person looks like, who gets to decide which bodies are acceptable in which spaces and under what conditions. And the reason these contests have been so fierce, so persistent, and so politically consequential is that clothing is not a superficial thing. It is one of the primary mechanisms through which social reality is constructed and maintained, and changing what people wear is one of the most direct ways of changing what social reality looks like. And in the final chapter, we'll bring all of this back to the most ordinary moment of your day and show you exactly what is really happening when you think you are just getting dressed. Chapter 9. You're still doing it tomorrow morning, your alarm will go off. You'll get up. And at some point before you walk out the door, you'll make a decision that feels trivial, what to wear. And you'll make it quickly, without much deliberation, without thinking of it as anything significant, and then you'll move on with your day, and probably never think about it again. But here's what's actually true about that moment. That decision is the end product of 170,000 years of cognitive evolution. Every neuron that fires when you scan your closet, every flash of mild anxiety when you realize you don't know what the dress code is, every small boost of confidence when you put on something that feels right. All of that is the output of systems that were shaped by selection pressures that predate civilization, predate agriculture, predate language as we know it. You are not picking clothes. You are running ancient software on modern hardware. And the software has one core function that has never changed. Manage how you are perceived so you can navigate your social environment effectively. That's it. That's what it's always been. Everything else, the fashion industry, the luxury brands, the trend cycles, the influencers, the fast fashion and the slow fashion and the sustainable fashion and the anti-fashion. All of it is downstream of that one ancient imperative. Control how you are seen. And the reason this matters, the reason it's worth understanding rather than dismissing as vanity or superficiality, is that the people who understand it have an enormous advantage over the people who don't. Because if you understand that clothing is a language, you can become fluent in it deliberately rather than just absorbing it unconsciously. If you understand that what you wear physically changes how your brain operates, as Hajo Adam and Adam Galinsky demonstrated in their 2012 research on enclothed cognition published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, showing that participants who wore a white lab coat described as a doctor's coat performed significantly better on attention tasks than those who wore the same coat described as a painter's coat. Then choosing your clothes in the morning is not a trivial act. It's an act of self-construction. It's deciding in advance what version of yourself you're going to inhabit today. And if you understand that others are reading your clothing as information before you've said a single word, as the research in social signal processing has repeatedly confirmed, then you understand that you are always already communicating, always already making an argument about who you are, whether you intend to or not. The only question is whether you're making that argument consciously or not. But there's something even deeper here than strategy and social navigation, something that gets at what clothing actually reveals about what kind of creature we are. Think about what it takes to experience shame about your body. It requires self-awareness, the ability to perceive yourself as an object in the world. It requires theory of mind, the ability to model how others perceive you. It requires the capacity to care about that perception, to feel its weight, to be moved by it, to want to change it. No other animal on Earth has all three of these simultaneously. The chimpanzee that Gallup tested in 1970 could recognize itself in a mirror, but it didn't go home afterward and think about what the other chimpanzees had thought of its appearance that day. Only we do that. Only we lie awake replaying social interactions and wondering how we came across. Only we feel retrospective embarrassment about something we wore 3 years ago. Only we construct elaborate systems of symbolic self-presentation that we then transmit to our children, who transmit them to their children across thousands of generations. And the fact that we do all of this, the fact that a simple question like "what should I wear today?" activates some of the most evolutionarily sophisticated neural machinery in the known universe, is not a sign of shallowness. It's a sign of depth. It's a sign of the specific kind of social complexity that made us the dominant species on this planet. We survived not because we were the strongest or the fastest or the most physically formidable. We survived because we could read each other, signal to each other, coordinate with each other, build trust with strangers, form alliances across distances, construct shared identities that persisted across generations. And clothing was one of the primary technologies through which we did all of that. It was one of the first systems we built for managing the social world. One of the first ways we found to say, without words, before words, "Here is who I am. Here is where I belong. Here is how I want you to see me." And we never stopped. From the first animal hide draped over a human body 170,000 years ago to the outfit you'll choose tomorrow morning, the impulse is the same. The technology has changed beyond recognition. The cities are bigger, the fabrics are more sophisticated, the signals are more complex, the codes are more layered. But the fundamental act, the act of standing before what you're going to wear and deciding who you want to be today, that act has not changed at all. You are doing exactly what your ancestors did. You are constructing yourself for the social world. You are managing your visibility. You are negotiating between who you are and who you want to be seen as. You are participating in the oldest continuous human practice we know of. And tomorrow morning, when you stand in front of your closet, you'll probably think you're just getting dressed. But now you know what's actually happening. You're not just getting dressed. You never were.